Good evening. Tonight we have the second lecture of the series presented by the undergraduate students. Before I introduce tonight's introducer, I just want to remind everyone that the 23rd of this month is Ruben Ortiz. He's presenting a multimedia exhibition, a lecture and performance. He's a Los Angeles-based multimedia artist. Welcome all of you tonight. I think tonight's lecture will be really amazing, and I want to introduce Kim Collin. Kim is a graduate of SCI-Arc in 1994. I had the pleasure of teaching Kim on a couple of occasions in graduate school. Since 2 years, she's been living in London, first in book publishing and editing with Phaidon, and currently she is teaching with Clive Sall, both at the AA and at the Royal College of Art, and their studio in both cases are all of the students, hopefully most of them are here tonight, have come to the West Coast, many for the first time, and they were also previously in Las Vegas. I'm sure that that material will be covered thoroughly tonight. So I want to introduce Kim Collin. Kim?
Thanks, Neil. I want to thank Neil and Margie Reeve and the lecture committee for arranging this lecture. And it's my pleasure to introduce Clive Sall. We teach, as Neil said, together at the Royal College of Art and also at the AA. And actually, none of our students are here. They did survive Vegas, but they're already in London. When I moved to London 2 years ago, the buzzwords for alternative practice, The buzzwords for alternative practice in the city consisted of one-syllable formations. They were fat, muff, and sham. These formations consisted of groups of intelligentsia that refused to conform to conservative representations of practice as signified by RIBA, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects, I'm sure as most of you know. Think about it, any organization with the word royal in it cannot be considered contemporary, but a relationship that smacks of currency can certainly be formed to that institution or any other, political or cultural, Its mission is to forge a different path through cultural practice, to force a dialogue, to beg for discussion, to demand attention. And that's exactly where Clive's work is cited. I think you'll see that tonight. To give you some background about Clive, he's originally from Johannesburg in South Africa. He left there in 1985 in frustration with the political climate there. He has a Bachelor of Architecture and completed his postgraduate studies at the University of Westminster, where he studied with David Green from Archigram and Kevin Robotham, who was here recently. In 1991, he attended Chelsea School of Art and Design for a Bachelor of Fine Art, while simultaneously forming a practice which later became known as FAT, or Fashion Architecture Taste, with one of his tutors, Kevin Robotham. He has since left FAT, but will tonight show projects that he either initiated or was primarily responsible for or collaborated on while associated with them. Currently, he's setting up an umbrella organization which facilitates a discourse between all visual practices, remaining expansive and collaborative in his vision. It's my pleasure to introduce Clive Sall tonight.
First things first, a big thanks to Neil Denari and to Margie Reeves and the lecture committee. But a personal thanks to Kim, who's been Batwoman completely and utterly. She's changed the way I've thought about teaching, and the person I taught with before her, Kevin Robotham, was the first person to do that. And she's a second, and that's an amazing feat. I've learned so much from her and really appreciate her presence both in London and her touring and ability to keep me in control in your fantastic country. But anyway, I'm going to have to read the first part of the lecture, and the reason being is that if I don't, it'll probably be too fast and furious. And again, if I do get to a point where what I'm saying isn't coherent or seems to be going faster than you can understand, do interrupt. If it gets boring, throw things. If you want to ask questions, do whatever you want to do. Again, there's a lot of work that you'll see, and the reason I just thought I'll show a lot of work rather than talking about very specific projects in detail is to suggest that the work I will be showing actually represents a large group of people, but also a fairly large output. And again, a lot of the projects are fairly repetitive in terms of talking about the same conditions, but using different formal strategies to try and set up certain discourses. If I could ask the slides to just run while I'm speaking in the beginning on the first two projectors, and you can just put them on whenever you want and take them off whenever you want, about 5 seconds a slide. Now, in the beginning, FAT used to be a collective and was constructed out of individuals too numerous to mention. A lot of people contributed to the ideas over a large period of time, and therefore what I'm presenting tonight includes the contribution of many people, as I said, some of them still in FAT, and a lot of them who have since departed, including Kevin, who you've met previously. Some of the text I will recite most definitely belongs to the group. To characterize my role in general, my position was formed in response to what I observed as limitations in the architectural profession. Here's the problem. There are limited venues for visibility for critical practice, as I'm sure you all know. To combat this situation, the work aims to invest architecture with a critical agenda, which draws on current conceptual tendencies in fine art as well as contemporary architectural practice and theory. Through a critical analysis of architectural representation, ideology, and iconography, the work raises questions about the current limits of architecture and the means of its production. Why FAT? Again, it's a stupid name, but it had a particular kind of resonance at the time. And it was intended to actually try and upset the normal condition, which was, you know, your surname plus someone else's surname and partners. FAT stands for fashion, or F stands for fashion, I suppose. Form follows fashion. It hints at a territory that architecture might occupy, that is volatile, fast-moving, image-led, prone to quotation and parody, and lying outside that ghostly cloud that permanently hovers over the architectural project, the search for the authentic. A is for architecture. If architectural culture is dominated by the visual, I ask, why does the profession and education system continue to champion the superior virtues of the technical? T is for taste. Taste, not space. High architecture regards space as its medium. It attempts to make meaning through the manipulation of space. Taste, however, is a mechanism by which architecture engages with its audience and its market. Taste communicates and locates the social, political, and financial meanings of architecture. It connects architecture with the wider cultural sphere in ways which are accessible beyond both academy and the profession. If architecture is to become culturally relevant, it must begin to recognize that authentic decisions are the primary concern. Taste engages the continuous issues of quality and value, which are matters of subjective deliberation, raising awkward issues of economic class. Taste counters the abstract geometries, the spatial gymnastics that obsess contemporary architecture, exposing its lack of immediacy and popular appeal. If you can start the video, doesn't matter if the slides aren't finished. I'll talk about this project you're about to see in much more detail later, but it'll just run while I'm speaking, so at least you've got something to look at. The project's called Red Dot, and I suppose it sets a tone for a lot of the projects that you'll see subsequently. It happened at the Royal Academy in 1994. It's an intervention where, in this particular institution, again, it's an art gallery which Turner and various people who you might be familiar with have shown their work. It's a very high cultural institution, very static, very paralyzed by its own profound meanings, I suppose. And what they do is they have a show in the summer where they've selected from a large selection of entries, because it's open to anyone who would like to enter for this moment in their cultural time, to submit a work of art, and they stick red dots next to the works of art that have sold. The problem with that is that that red dot confers not only economic status in the work, but as well as that, a cultural status. And what we did was, in this situation, and as I say, I'll talk about it more later, is to stick red dots on everything in the gallery, 7,000 dots on everything we could touch. But I'll continue about the practice. And I'll quote David Green from Archigram. And the reason I'll quote him is, firstly, I think that he's a person that, as an academic, one can most respect. He's never ever lost his integrity. But also because he surmises objectives in the most clear way that would be possible. And what he said was that, central to the work, he thought that the image, as a site of collisions from different taste regimes and different conceptual locations, was the most present aspect. Secondly, the acceptance that the search for the authentic, single concept is a futile undertaking. Thirdly, the notion that the aim of the architectural project is to filter, select, cut and paste from a selection of cultural sources in order to produce new arguments which vibrate with references to the familiar. To paraphrase from the work of Fatt, we draw on sources as varied as the situationalists and advertising, and as contradictory as Dada and Disney. Our strategies make use of visual languages which communicate complex and critical ideas to an audience beyond the usual architectural community. We see collaboration and engagement in wider cultural issues as essential to architecture if it is to retain its role as the orchestrator of urban life in fierce competition from advertising and media. Our approach is therefore concept and content-based, as opposed to abstract and formal. Its goals are to circumvent existing taste regimes. Devices such as irony, humor, and narrative produce critical commentary which engage both popularist and specialist audience. Where most academic-based debates, influenced by intellectual agendas outside of architecture, have tended to exist solely within the academy, Fatt's strategies have been firmly rooted in practice. I am interested in how theory informs practice primarily. Issues addressed in the work include authorship, authenticity, and the authority of existing institutions. Use of other media, for instance, the internet, magazines, writing, as sites for architectural communication. Redefinition of space through particular occupations. Relationship between popular and high culture. Blurring of boundaries between different disciplines. And most importantly, collaboration. We have sought to go beyond traditional forms of collaboration, i.e. artists working with architects, traditional client-architect relationships. The way this has been done is an attempt to make architecture, or the reason why this is done, is an attempt to make architecture more inclusive of other agendas, such as politics, communication, and popular culture. We want the work to contain dynamic contradictions and to presence many competing ideologies. We are opposed to the myth of the creative genius, which is not consistent with collaboration. We want to invent systems and methodologies that necessitate the collaboration of others. The projects employ the architect's organizational skills to more diverse ends, requiring the development of databases that facilitate huge networks of communication between visual art practitioners and other groups. For us, architectural space includes communication orchestration. My goal was to expand the practice outwards from purely architectural issues to include other disciplines, I began to employ the tactics that normally are more akin to contemporary art practice or more accessible visual practices such as advertising. Those are the posters that were given out to people going into the galleries. Everyone who went into the gallery was given a poster. And the poster tried to suggest to that spectator different conditions of cultural engagement or different ideologies that condition that type of engagement. Could we have the slides? Sorry, the other two carousels. Just out of curiosity, are most people here architects? Is anyone here who's not an architect? Because that'll... I'm just trying to find out what the majority of the audience are. Are they architects or from other visual practices? Because that'll just make me sort of talk in a particular way or talk about or preference certain projects. Okay, anyway. Not a good answer. Right. On your left, a project called The People's Princess. In London, there was a competition for a bridge that would link the north to the south bank. And in London, they don't ever build anything. So when they do build things, everyone tries to get that job, including fosters and people that you think wouldn't bother. But obviously, we bothered, but we didn't win. And what we did was we proposed a bridge which was a living monument to Princess Diana. Now, when people first saw it, they loved it until they found out what it was. They thought it was a fantastic landscape, which had been, in its most architectural perfect form, reconstituted in an impossible condition across a bridge spanning north to south. But when they found out that actually it was a dedication to Princess Diana, that's when it all went pear-shaped. And that's when we got thrown out. Basically what it is, it's a piece of Althorp Park, which is where Princess Diana was born and obviously where she now laid. That's where she's buried. But it's also part of Samuel Lapridge's 18th century landscape, which again is part of the Romantic landscape tradition in the UK. And the words on the side of the bridge are Elton John's English Rose. Saying bye. Because obviously what was fantastic about her was she was one of the few people that lay outside of the control of the institution, although she was very much part of it. True terrorist. So that was our dedication to her, but it didn't, obviously, as I say, get further than concept stage. And again, a lot of these projects that I'll show you in this first part are about speculations, about what happens if, what happens if you champion something that, especially in a European context, seems completely and utterly ridiculous. And it's ridiculous for various reasons, as I said. Firstly, because it lies outside of what normally constitutes architectural discourse, but often it resides in what would be considered to be the popular. And in architecture, the popular isn't particularly popular. Again, in the USA, I suppose it's completely different. I mean, what we try to do would be invisible here, because it would be something that, people who own commercial space do without the need of architects. I mean, we try and do what people who aren't architects do, which in the European context is to propose an architecture of resistance. So again, when you look at these projects, what you should understand is that everything about Europe is about permanence. It's about something which offers up a certain kind of specific, let's just say linear trajectory from a beginning all the way through to an end. Nothing's younger than 100 years old. Everything really has a huge history. But again, in these projects, the kind of history that it has is either something which will be accepted, incorporated, or dismissed out of hand. The one on the left, or your right, is Big Ben, but it's Bigger Ben. It's about 5 times the size of Big Ben. And it's social housing in the Greenbelt, which is an area where you can't build. And the reason you can't build there is because things look horrible, because architects fuck up everything. So what you do is you make it look nice. And the way to make it look nice is you give them something that they like, which is a fantastic kind of solution to a difficult and awkward problem. But again, they didn't want to build that. Next, please. I mean, I suppose projects that reside... Oh, sorry. Thanks. Forward, I suppose, is a good one. Two projects which are much more, let's just say, inside of an architectural discourse and possibly are much more arcane. On your left, that's the Fat House, which, in a simple way, it tries to reconstitute the spatial arrangements in a typical domestic terraced Georgian house. The green object is a living room, the bedroom, sorry, and the bathroom. The yellow object is the sofa, which is the living room, which is 5 meters by 3 meters. The kitchen is that area just below the green pod. And then the bottom landscape is where you lounge around and bathe at the end. And the orange object is the heating, ventilation, and mechanical services. But it's not particularly interesting. On the right-hand side, something much more interesting, which is the anti-Oedipal house. And basically what they propose is that the idea is that, your mum and dad certainly screw with your mind. So maybe it would be better if you actually got separated from them, but still had a relationship with them. And so what this project proposed was that the parents would live in this Mesian cum Philip Johnson glass house, the rhombic-shaped, clear, translucent one, where they could play out their obsession with cleanliness and dinner parties, whereas the kids would live in the pink object, which is a masturbatorium, where they could do whatever they wanted and play out their fantasies without anyone getting in anyone's way and upsetting each other. And again, these are conditions that, in architecture are always taken for granted, the suppressive gaze, the relationship between spaces, which are never innocent. And so what these projects try to do was to try and talk about these particular relationships in a way that obviously is fairly explicit, but maybe it was a bit of fun. Do they go together? Oh, there's two of them. Scary. This is the Cardiff Opera House competition. Again, someone who won this was Zaha Hadid, who's a fantastic architect, but they just took it away from her because she's not the right kind of architect who should win architectural proposals of this nature. But we knew that we didn't have a chance to win this one, to be fairly honest. So what we thought we'd do was to submit a proposal that was so arcane that the jury, who were supposed to be specialists, wouldn't even be able to interpret themselves. And again, the reason for this was to sort of question the way we understand representation. And in this particular case, what we were trying to talk about was that when you think about, let's just say, American football or English soccer, what's fantastic about those sports is that when you see the commentators speaking about this particular experience, they talk about it in ways which architects can never talk about abstract space. Architects always talk about it in such a dry manner that it's fantastic to see someone talking about those relationships as ebbs and flows, which are legible and have meaning to people who are observing it, i.e. the spectator. The notion of threat, danger, attack, promise, big, tight, pressure, open, all of those conditions exist quite comfortably within that particular terrain. And how does an architecture try and appropriate that particular condition is something that interests us in this project. So the proposal was just to make a mound. That would be the opera house. And on that mound, certain events would occur. And those events would be conditioned by those spectators, and that would be the opera. So again, in these projects, the idea of trying to understand, how architects see and why they do see what they see, and how people see who aren't architects, and maybe trying to work out which one might be more appropriate or interesting. And maybe real life is more interesting than what architects think it might be. Maybe real life is interesting enough, and architects just need to somehow curate it. That's it. Where did I face it? Oh. So again, this is the Royal Academy, and I'll try and put these slides in context. Again, you've seen the video. As you can see, old building, famous. Oh, sorry. So as I said, what irritated me about this particular condition was the fact that I was a student studying fine art at the time, And what irritated me more than anything else in the whole world was the fact that they talk about these events as being inclusive, that anyone can submit work and they'll select it from a submission of, let's just say in this case, something like 10,000 pieces. They select about 1,100. And what they do is they stick red dots on the work that's sold. And the problem with that is that when you go to galleries, 1,000 pieces of work to look at, you tend to move from red dot to red dot, because obviously that red dot confers not only economic status, but cultural status. And it's impossible to see 1,000 pieces of work in one day. So what that red dot does, it negates the fact that that spectator can actually have a critical gaze. It makes them conform to something which pre-exists and actually acts as a way of curating it and editing out everything else. And so in order to neutralize that situation, as I said, all we did was very economically stick 7,000 red dots on everything. But also at the same time hand out a poster which talked about certain issues that were central to the way that these particular conditions are constructed, and to maybe try and get the spectator to understand that. But obviously, as you can see, when you stick 50 red dots on one little insignificant piece of work, what does that mean? What happens? Does it kind of all meaning collapse, or is all meaning resurrected? And obviously the gallery got very upset and they called the police and they confiscated all the posters and said it was anti-Semitic, which I'm not quite sure how that worked out. But when the police arrived, we said no, it wasn't, and they went away. But it terrified the gallery. I mean, it's amazing to see how terrified they were. I think I'm having trouble on the left. Again, another similar type of proposal. This is the Turner Prize Picket. Same thing, Tate Gallery once a year have an annual event where they choose from a short list of people who've been nominated by anyone in the whole of the UK who is the most significant British visual practitioner. And obviously if you're Maurice Sarchi and you nominate your particular geezer, then you're going to win. And it excludes everyone else who it's supposed to represent without their particular contribution. So I went around and did some lectures at schools and just told everyone, you know, come on down to the Tate on the night of the Turner Prize. And obviously on that night there's television and there's lots of media interest, and so it's a very convenient way to quite quickly disseminate a view and set up a discourse which normally is not available to people outside of their institution. And so everyone brought their work and placed that work on a stick. Went backwards. So again, you know, the idea that what happens when 300 artists come down to the Tate on the wrong night. But also, more importantly, at that same time, in England, there was a new bill passed which became part of criminal legislation, which is called the Criminal Justice Bill, which prohibits more than 19 people meeting simultaneously in the same place without the prior consent of the police, which is ridiculous. So I was basically thinking, well, one way to see what happens if you kind of predominantly of a certain economic class and a certain kind of cultural background, are they going to arrest you? Probably not. And so we went down on that night and had a huge party, and 1,000 people came to the party, and it was a successful and interesting event. But it was quite interesting in terms of how these particular kind of projects relate to the notion of gallery, but also how they talk about the notion of a city. I seem to not be able to get this. Oh, shit. A similar kind of project where basically people were invited, again artists in this case, to bring their work outside the Serpentine Gallery. And the Serpentine Gallery, much like the Tate Gallery, promotes certain individuals. And we knew it was the last day of the actual exhibition, so we thought, what happens when, you know, 100 artists arrive and just start putting their work out? So it's a bit like Crufts, which is a dog show or a classic car show or a village fete, that you basically just commandeer the landscape and reinvent a formal condition. And again, it was also in response to the Criminal Justice Bill, because that was the kind of next Saturday after it became legislation. Outpost. I mean, again, this is probably one of the projects I thought was most successful. It was a project, again, that sort of, somehow, I don't know why, but these things seem to kind of occupy my mind. And I thought, I don't know if you know about the Venice Biennale, but it's this huge event that happens in Italy. And each person that represents a country is nominated by the country and tends to be a 40-year-old white middle-class male. And most artists seem to think that if you don't get represented in your lifetime at the Biennale, you're a failure. So I thought maybe I'll be able to make people less miserable. So I invited 1,000 people to come to the Venice Biennale. And obviously, in terms of strategically, it's quite difficult to take 1,000 artists with no budget. So I thought what I could do was make them produce work which would, which would be the size of a business card. And it was separated in two parts. On the top, you'd have the image card, which is obviously the artwork itself, and the bottom would be the signature. And the signature would be dispensed, the image card would be dispensed free of charge from dispensers placed in and around the Venice Biennale. And that would be for free, and each artist had to produce 100 minimum of each of those two pieces, which meant that there was over 100,000 pieces of works of art being distributed from each of these venues. And the venues in themselves were placed throughout the city and included everything from the predictable high art galleries to go-go bars, Burger King, etc. And the reason being is that the question I was trying to ask was that the relationship between the site and where the work is consumed has a direct influence on the value of that particular piece of work. So a lot of the people who participated were YBAs, which are young British artists, who, again, their work is, in terms of economically, hugely valuable. And these things would be given to anyone who wanted them free of charge. And what we were trying to do was to ask the question that if you have to explore the city in a way that wasn't somehow related to a particular kind of intended strategy of that city, how might you read the city? And obviously in this case, people were going to hospitals to have to collect these things, or to railway stations, candy stores, strip bars, whatever. I seem to be having trouble getting these things to actually do anything. If I just put my hand up, is it possible just to change them when I do that, or is it too much of a pain? Sorry, that one. If you can go back on that one. Just this one here on the left. So again, what was interesting to me about this project was that obviously it didn't conform to the notion of the monumental, nor to the authentic, that the artwork itself was 2 by 3 inches as opposed to 6 by 5 foot. That it was free of charge, that you could touch it, that you could own it. So again, the fact that the gesture was one of generosity. But when you collected the work, how you actually kept this work was up to you. There was a catalogue which was obviously empty, except for a map and critical essays. And you as a spectator became the critic in the way that you chose which work to keep. You became the collector, again, in the way that you kept the work that you liked. And you became the you became the critic, curator, and collector. And the collector, in terms of, if you chose to collect the signature, you'd go back to a desk which was located in various venues where you could purchase a corresponding signature card. And the price of that card was determined by the artists themselves. In the case of the Venice Biennale, the money went to Turin and Sarajevo, and the reason being is that Venice and Sarajevo are twin cities. So again, trying to make that particular exchange go beyond the normal operative tactics. And again, as you can imagine, when people came back to this desk, I mean, there was huge conversations about the significance of the artwork and why people preferred painting as opposed to photocopies, which was curious in a particular kind of 21st century condition. You know, why do people still believe that a painting has more value than a photocopy is something that confuses me. But I obviously understand in terms of the reasons to support such an attitude. And again, as you can see, I mean, this just gives you an example. You know, there's no censorship or editing, so people can put in what they want. And none of the galleries actually complain, because the way it's done is actually kind of fairly discreet. So the issues that are actually presented in the work have high content. I mean, there's things that you would see dispute in these particular dispensers that normally galleries wouldn't put in. I mean, for example, the one on your left is the artist's urine. And again, the idea would be that it maps out the territory, because obviously these dispensers were placed throughout the city in about 10 different venues or 18 different venues, and you would have to go and collect them. So much like a dog, it marks a territory. And the signature card was a glove, so that you could actually sort of occupy that piece of work. On the right-hand side, the artist would say to the spectator in this case that you have to determine the value of the work of art. You fill in the amount, and that's what you pay for that particular piece. Again, I mean, the interesting thing to me is the idea of narrative. How does one structure a narrative in architecture? And it's very difficult. In this case, we're doing a billboard, which is part of a Dan Graham exhibition at the Camden Arts Centre. And I invited two friends of mine who are artists on that particular billboard, which is obviously outside the gallery, or on your right-hand side. Nearest to me is the work of Sarah Dubai. In the middle, which is completely invisible probably, is John Isaacs, who's dressed as a caveman, and on the left is Fat. And again, this billboard was taken down by the police. And the ridiculousness of it was there actually was no content, but the image was described as being satanic and, violent. So CNN complained about its content, and the school next door complained, and the church to the right of this particular institution complained. And the incredible thing was that actually it didn't have any meaning. I won't speak about those, but obviously I won't. That's okay. Again, I often do pieces at certain times when there's a conflict. So during the Kosovan War or the Iraq-Kuwait crisis, there's certain pieces done in response to that. But maybe I'll talk about those later. Again, other projects that interest me are trying to work with students. In this case, took a group of students up to Glasgow, and we did an exhibition for 8-year-olds. And what we did was an environment, in this case it's a living room, where an 8-year-old might actually occupy and act out their particular kind of needs. And again, I mean, there's a lot of various agendas going on in this, but maybe I'll just talk about one or two. And obviously the notion of cut and paste, I mean, you can see from the actual imagery, the idea of taking tree houses and domestic staircases, but maybe kind of issues that were more important in terms of, let's just say, for example, the football table, which tries to speak about issues of gender. And how do you explain to an 8-year-old what sexism is? So one quick way we thought was convert half of the team into women and leave the other half as men. And obviously what always happened was that when the kids came to play, none of the boys wanted to be the girls. And so again, it was quite an easy way to introduce to them issues that maybe normally in architectural practice lie outside of one's remit. Again, a shop. I won't speak too much about that. I mean, projects that interest me are about social space. I mean, those are the ones that, to me, seem to have most resonance. This is a particularly nasty environment. I mean, it's a kind of welfare social housing estate where people who live there are temporary. I mean, they're immigrants, lower income, etc. And I mean, I was quite curious about ideas of memory and how one can actually facilitate an opportunity to express that within an urban condition. And so what happened was we set up a flower store in the actual estate, and people were invited to come along and collect free flowers on condition that they took one home and that they placed one within the environment. And what they had to do was write a letter, or sorry, a tag, and on that tag talk about a certain incident that had happened to them in a particular place within that estate. And so they then had to take that particular bouquet and attach it to that significant location, and then, as I say, take the other one home. So the whole estate became a floral tribute to the memory of each of those individuals about some significant event that had affected them. Another kind of project where questions about identity seem to be maybe a kind of issue that architecture normally excludes. And it was something that happened in Londonderry, which is Northern Ireland. And obviously, you know, Northern Ireland people don't get on particularly well for whatever reasons. And so we set up a computer terminal, one in a Protestant shopping mall and one in a Catholic shopping mall. And we asked people who were just passing by to sit down and construct an image of themselves in any way that they wanted. So again, they could customize anything from history to, in a way, externalize their aspirational condition. And what happened was that the images that were produced, obviously they're in control of the production, were downloaded in two forms. One is a dye sublimation, which went into a frame, and that in turn was placed in a gallery, and one onto a T-shirt. And the kind of question being asked was which one was the valuable one, which one actually, at the end of the day, is authentic. But more importantly, what happened was that everyone then had to come to the gallery on the opening private view night. So you've got a whole mix of people that normally would be excluded from those particular institutions, coming to those environments and actually kind of congregating in a way that previously was not possible. And again, the idea of cut and paste is something that obviously can get transferred into architecture, that how does one locate the actual user in a way that is familiar to them. This project's for a nightclub where the idea of sampling, which at that time was something which was present within music culture, but in architecture was always seen as a problematic condition. And so the idea in this case was to say to oneself, is if we take familiar environments like airports and domestic interiors and put them side by side, what would that particular kind of landscape look like, and what would that reveal to that user, and how would they actually occupy that environment? And again, as you can see, I mean, from a lot of the images, the work itself does have quite a close relationship with the means of production in terms of Photoshop and how that influences the way that the actual architecture is constructed, but in terms of its conceptual construction rather than its technical one. Again, just a house within a house, a big garden shed, 2 stories high. And the windows are like an advent calendar, they open and close. The person wanted to pretend that they lived in Africa, even though quite clearly they were in the middle of Europe. So we had to give them an interior landscape that reminded them of the place they came from. This project's called Mod Cons. And again, the idea of Mod Cons was to talk about the city and how the city might change and how the city might be an ephemeral experience as opposed to the permanent or the monument, the definite. And again, things that are always curious is that when you have the Formula One race in the Principality of Monaco, which is a bit like Indianapolis 500, but instead of going round and round the same circuit, they just race through the city, which is a fantastic architectural moment. How does one try and, in a way, change one's perception of something that people are so familiar with that they sort of don't see anymore? And so the idea in this case was to sort of place the domestic object within that urban context and see how people would actually relate to them. So a whiskey bottle on the railing in Oxford Street, which is probably the most busy street in London, the whole bottle was finished in about 10 minutes. You know, people were just congregating. It became a pub outdoors. People were trying to switch the lights on and off in Piccadilly Circus, which again is a very kind of typical tourist site where there's a monument and people come there to see something which is actually just an advert on a building. So again, to try and sort of allow that particular spectator or that viewer to become proactive in the way that they engage with that particular environment. You know, if you pay for your parking meter, you can do what you want. So again, you know, set up a living room, watch telly, do whatever you want to do. And so to try and see what happens, you know, with these absurdist gestures, that always they cause a reaction which is one of, you know, humor, but more importantly, it sets up the kind of condition where it's impossible not to understand what this is trying to contend with or contest. Um, this project is an advertising agency. And again, looking at the familiar and looking at the idea of the city and talking about things which implode and explode. What was interesting about this project, it was done for someone who actually lived in a different country, in this case, Holland. And the whole project had to be done over a fax machine, which is incredibly interesting when you're trying to propose an architectural condition to a client where your only form of communication is a diagram, essentially. And so every single day we just fax them different diagrams, Apache forts, Baywatch towers, garden sheds. And we'd set up a legend, and they could choose from this legend which ones they thought were interesting to them. And so we were trying to make something possible which could be customized, something which could exist in a grade 1 listed building, because in this church you couldn't actually fix anything to the actual structure. But also something that was playful, something that actually talked about the way that the clients thought about themselves, something which talked about a commodity that represents an attitude rather than a value. And what was interesting about this project is that the kind of most important thing to the client is that they think it functions better than any other space they've ever occupied, that it doesn't have the aesthetic of a photocopy machine, but more importantly, it works a lot better. And again, it's a bit like being inside a city when you actually go to this building. You can sit wherever you want. You can move from desk to desk, which obviously is called hot desking. But in this case, it's not just a desk. It's actually, you can move from one environment to the next. And so people, when they sort of, pissed off, hide inside the Baywatch Tower, or when they're feeling kind of fantastic, they climb up into the top of the Apache fort. I mean, the top of the fort's about 3-4 stories high. Again, collage. The familiar. Using bus shelters in this case, 250 of them in and around central London. And in this case, we were basically trying to turn the city, much as I said before, into an urban condition that could be somehow weaved together in a way that architects never get the opportunity to do. But also it was strategic in the way that it preferenced a certain project which we knew we could get if we just moved towards it in terms of scales. So again, three-dimensional audiovisual installations using those bus shelters. But the one on your right, I mean, each of them have a very specific contextual meaning. On the right-hand side, this particular bus shelter was done by Beaconsfield, and it's located outside a mortgage lending company. And the aesthetic tries to refer back to a vernacular, a past that is now lost, as far as the producers in this particular case are concerned. But also on the actual two-dimensional sites, it refers to certain statistics, and those statistics are about how much the private sector, in terms of housing, has been sold, how much of the public sector, in terms of housing, has been sold to the private sector. Because in the United Kingdom, most people own their houses, and those that don't tend to be in government-subsidized accommodation. So again, it was trying to sort of make people become aware of certain issues which, using just a bus shelter is phenomenal. But also some things, which were much more humorous, Donkey Kong, karaoke at your bus shelter. And again, all these people who are actually producing these works, on your left-hand side is Peter Saville, who designs the covers for Suede and New Order. So people who come from various disciplines and see the city in very particular ways, but somehow can express very clearly and succinctly a specific attitude to the way that they think. Nigel Coates, who's our professor at the Royal College of Art. So again, in this particular project, I mean, the audio, as I say, each one had an audio, was techno music, but it was from an environment which normally, let's say, people who are homophobic find problematic, which is a men's toilet in nightclubs. And so what he was doing was turning the bus shelter into urinal, turning the city inside out. That if you go to a nightclub and you're gay, the best place to go is the toilets. And so he was trying to sort of talk about these issues in a way which is very difficult to talk to 10,000 people a day about. And, you know, the footfall on these particular projects are huge. I mean, you can understand that people going past these bus shelters is something like 10,000 to 80,000, depending on the location. And each site had a kind of explanatory text talking about what the issue was that the project was trying to engage with. Similarly, on the left-hand side, that's Rankin from Dazed and Confused, which is a kind of youth magazine. And this particular bus shelter was outside a 5-star hotel and talked about homelessness. And the track was Billy Bragg, who again is a musician involved with social issues. So again, you know, projects which talk about very kind of specific and problematic issues, but in a way which definitely includes the audience and doesn't exclude them from becoming opinionated without becoming racist or let's just say dogmatic. I mean, a perfect beam shining on a bus shelter causing a sort of theatrical circle of light. Turning 1 mile of a city into a one-day beach. You know, the whole city was, well, this particular area of the city was turned into a beach for the day. So everything, the movie houses to the stores. And so again, I mean, how people would occupy that particular condition was highly kind of curated. The last project, and again, I mean, the questions will probably reveal more about the intentions than the lecture will. I was always interested about the fact that when you go to estate agents and you look in the windows, that the images are one of the few times, or the few occasions that you actually get to see inside a British home. Because most people in Britain tend to be fairly, let's just say, I don't know what the word would be, but it's not a culture where one exhibits your economic prowess or your social standing. It's a very secluded condition. But that photograph in that window is one of the few times where you actually see that particular inhabitant looking at their world much like an architect does. And that fascinates me for two reasons. One was that if one could actually explore that issue and make it external, what that might reveal about that particular context, that particular street as a gallery. But also, how could one actually make those people articulate their particular sensibility in a way that artists would, talking about those same very issues, those social commentaries. So I went along to two streets, one in a deprived area and one in a very affluent area. In fact, and on the left-hand side, that's the same area Tony Blair, who's the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, lives. And each inhabitant was invited to choose from 100 images produced by artists, photographers, architects, an image that they would like to have produced on one side of a for sale sign, and that for sale sign being the normal icon that goes outside a house when it is for sale. And what would happen was that once they'd chosen a particular piece, on your left-hand side, those are the artist's work, and on the right-hand side is the collaboration between that inhabitant and that artist to produce the second side. So obviously they'd become the critic in the way they'd selected the work, they'd become the producer in the fact that they'd worked collaboratively with the artist, and also they could own both pieces afterwards. And what was interesting to me was the fact that when they had to choose, there was no signature on the work, much like the Outpost project, the small cards, that the way you chose to keep this work wasn't because you knew it had prior value, you chose it because you liked it. And when you went to get the signature, much like this, when you actually found out who the artist was, you'd either have chosen that work, and in the case of the people who lived in Islington, which is the more affluent area, they'd always try to choose a work conditioned by the fact that they assumed that the economic value would be one which would determine that choice, whereas the ones from less affluent areas would tend to choose the work that they liked. That was the only reason they chose it, because they liked it. And so again, you know, on your right-hand side, the family that live in the house, making a piece with that artist. In terms of streets, the one on your left is the more socially sponsored housing, and on the right is the much more affluent condition. And so again, I mean, people walked up and down the streets, and it was an opportunity for them to actually sort of look and see, what these particular individuals actually understood or thought about themselves, or how they represented their particular cultural, political, or social aspirations. Could we have the video after these last two? The video is just basically that of the Turner Prize, which is depicted outside the Tate Gallery, and this is going to run silently. So if you want to ask questions, that's the time. None. The question is, how does one set up a collaboration with specific reference to the For Sale Sign project, which is Homo Deals, or Outpost, which is the small cards? Again, I mean, collaboration's a fairly simple thing to set up if you have a strategy which is inclusive. So in the case of Homo Deals, it just worked in a way which was fairly natural, that I just knocked on doors of each of the inhabitants' houses and said, would you like to participate, and explained what the project was about. And once one person began to do it, the whole street then obviously began to become involved. In terms of artists, I basically invited people I knew to invite people that they knew, which meant that I wasn't trying to choose people because I thought they were good or bad. It was more about sort of people who could understand what the actual critical agenda of the project was, and thought that that would be in itself worthy of participation. So in the case of the Venice Biennale project, there was no limit on the amount of artists that could work on the project. There were 1,200 at the end. The thing that decided when and who would participate would be the termination date, the closing date of entry for that work to be submitted. So again, I mean, if, let's say for Homo Deals, which is a for sale sign, if I could have had enough budget to support, 200 artists or 400, that would be the one constraint that would limit it. I mean, it was the size of my suitcase going to Venice, and or my suitcase and friend's suitcase, and in the case of the Outpost, I mean the Homo Deals, it was just purely budget for reproduction of images. No other questions? You must have some questions. So the question was, again, I have to repeat the questions for the video, is who does one preference to collaborate with? And in the projects, there seems to be a preference for artists over architects. And again, I mean, in all the projects you've seen, there's a kind of huge mix. I mean, in terms of Outpost and roadworks and ad site and all the art projects, the actual practitioners come from a range of disciplines, including fashion, vehicle design, all the way through to architecture. In terms of actual architectural projects where the final outcome is one which is habitable space, we tend to get artists involved, so artists come on board and actually look at the spatial relationships, or look at the formal conditions that are available, and propose projects. So for example, a project I didn't show because it didn't turn out the way we intended, which was a nightclub, was to commission 10 visual practitioners and 10 architects to work simultaneously in the same project and create permanent installations that would then in themselves become the architecture. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's not about preferencing one discipline over the other. It's more about what context one is working within and how that, in a way, allows certain people the opportunity or disallows other people. So artists are much more willing to work for nothing than architects. So normally architects always just say, no, I'm not interested if there's no money, whereas artists tend, especially in the UK, to actually survive on absolutely no income, but produce work because to them that is their visible opportunity to make their work kind of cited and seen. Yeah, I mean, it was more about, let's just say, in terms of the UK, I mean, what people find formally interesting tends to be architecture which conforms with a much more myopic view of what is possible. And by that I mean, if you look at, let's just say, high tech in particular, there's a huge fascination with the technical, how things are put together. That in itself becomes an architectural style. And because there's actually so little to build, people, as practitioners, architects, tend to put or place a lot of value on the way that the detail works, or the way that the glazing junction works with the wall or the floor. Whereas what, let's say, FAT is more interested in is maybe what that particular project communicates rather than exactly how it might be built. I mean, obviously how it's built is important. Well, I mean, it's a flippant statement, but let's just say, for example, when I was driving around LA with Kim, what struck me as fantastic was the fact that there seems to be so little legislation that that sort of inhibits people from expressing whatever, whether it's economic or whether it's social, whatever you want to call it, their agendas. I mean, if you want to have a big sign outside your shop, you just make it big and you paint your facade pink. If you try to do the same thing in the UK, and obviously one hopes that the people who are making a big sign and painting their facade pink do that because there's a particular kind of content or particular relationship between the way that they're painting their shop or illustrating or articulating their location. But it's something where what inhibits most practitioners in the UK is this kind of, as I say, this formula or this formulaic formal condition which is inherent within the planning restrictions. And I'm sure you have planning restrictions here, but it means that if you wanted to, let's say, shiplap your whole facade, or if you wanted to use corrugated steel, you wouldn't be allowed to. It just isn't possible. So the kind of the bandwidth in which one can play is very, very kind of minimal. Whereas here, that obviously I'm not saying everything you see is fantastic and it all looks beautiful and I think it's the best architecture in the whole world. But it's more about the actual kind of latitude that one seems to be able to operate within. Georgian architecture. Yeah. I think if you're going to be critical, one has to operate against that which oppresses one. So at the end of the day, as I said, oh yeah, lots of things. Top five. Oh God, this could get scary. I could never be let back into this country. I could maybe never be let back into this country or never teach ever. Well, I mean, again, I mean, let's just say, I mean, what's curious about, and are we talking about aesthetics here or politics? Because again, I mean, God, this is a... Right, so the question is the top 5 things that would infuriate me most. The president, I mean, again, in terms of, because again, it wouldn't just be kind of aesthetics. I mean, the politics in this country obviously are something that there's huge amounts of opportunity to express or vent frustration. So again, I mean, how does one, make an architecture which talks about a condition which promotes an attitude globally, whether it's in Central America or whether it's in the Middle East, which might not necessarily be the right one, but sort of confirms that an economic strategy that seems to be readily assimilated without question. But that doesn't go for people in this room. I'm saying that just the general is what interests me rather than the specific. Another thing that might interest me is the fact that if you can build anything you want and make it look like anything you desire, how do you make an architecture of stealth, of something that is invisible? When there's so much noise, how do you make an architecture which is quiet? Maybe another thing that would interest me would be that if you have a country where there seems to be a very specific kind of identity to the West and East and nothing in the middle, how do you sort of operate in that space between? And I mean in terms of a kind of the rhetoric of being in between. That, why when people talk about the USA, I've never understood this because I've never lived here, is it always preference to West and East Coast in terms of whether it's architecture or critical practice, whatever. I mean, what does let's say critical practice look like for a hillbilly? Other things, I've only been here for a week, so it's quite hard to tell. How high could you build would interest me. What's the biggest structure you could make? Because I mean, I've never seen such big buildings. When we went to Las Vegas, I mean, those are the size of cities. If you could build one of those things in your lifetime in the UK, you'd be the most prolific architect. So again, I mean, how does one make an architecture which is bigger than anything that's ever been built? I mean, because the funny thing about Vegas is that, architects, if they play their cards right, are being given an opportunity to become city planners and to invest that discourse called architecture with something which seems at this stage to only be present within advertising, which means that what happens when a building becomes a brand? What happens if you take, let's just say, New York in Las Vegas to its extreme, what happens when a city, let's just say, for example, some place in the middle of nowhere, can actually change its identity, much like Frank Gehry's building and Bilbao does for that particular kind of center. It gives it a certain visibility that otherwise would never, ever be present. So that would be something that interests me. In the UK, you could never, ever change the way a whole city looks. Whereas in this country, it seems that if you've got enough money, whether you're a developer or whether you're a person in power, you can actually quite quickly alter the whole terrain. Another thing I'd be interested in is the notion of permanence. How do you make an architecture of permanence in a culture which is about the impermanent? Is that 5? Oh no, I love it.
My question is why? Because one suspects that on the one hand, when you think about the various kinds of traditions and practices, whether it's fluxes, situations, etc., and you're delivering your criticism through very, very simple reactionary terms, whether you apply to a feeling or emotion or a momentary sense of politics. I think most of us will try to understand that, but do you feel as though that
I have to repeat this for the video? Okay, and I'm trying to work out if I have to repeat your question for them upstairs, which I think is impossible. But if let's just say I can understand the question in terms of why would one go do a BA Fine Art, I mean, why I did it was that when I looked at people like Jeff Koons or people like Sherry Levine or let's just think of other people who I thought were, John Baldessari, what was always fascinating to me about those individuals is that they seem to have a very kind of very ambitious way of looking at the world, but it was a way of looking at the world which also somehow had a very specific relationship to the way that they critically understood what was interesting to themselves. And as architects, we're always found frustrating, especially, as I say, I did my fine art straight after I finished architecture, and at the same time I was teaching at the Bartlett, postgrad architecture. But what always confused me about architecture was that continuously you ask students what their viewpoint is. How does one establish a position? And most architects are always reluctant to do that. They always take up a position which is to do with style or form, but they never take up one which is to do with an ideology or a position which might be political, social, or cultural. Whereas artists seem to do that quite comfortably. I'm not saying all artists. You obviously get people like Yves Klein who might operate right across that band. But what was interesting to me was that you could get a group like Fluxus working together, much like Archigram did, who would somehow try and establish a position within contemporary cultural practice that would export a view to as wide a popular audience as they could. But artists don't seem as afraid as architects to sort of stand up and fail. At the end of the day, if fine art taught me anything, was that, there is no one answer. And also, to get it wrong is the same as getting it right. It just means that you've learned from that particular position how to modify your strategy. And so, what was quite clear was that if you, well, to me anyway, was if you're trying to make an architecture, it seemed more appropriate to adopt strategies which might, let's say, fit more comfortably in advertising or fine art or some other practice, and somehow transfer them and place them upon that discourse called architecture and see what happened. And the reason being was that if in the UK, myself and Kevin or whoever else, in fact, would try to have set up a practice which made good architecture, and that's all it did, we'd be nowhere. And not to say that, economically, but just in terms of critically, that people don't take you seriously unless you actually sort of make very specific intentions clear. And I don't know how many architects can do that. There are few people that succeed, and that is a difficult task. But artists, there's a lot of artists who actually succeed quite successfully in communicating very, very difficult issues in the most economic way possible. And that, to me, was reason enough to do it. Just the economy of that and that clarity of that particular discourse and what it meant to them and them only. That they were without ego in many cases, but very specific about what was right and wrong, what was something they were willing to do and something they weren't willing to do. Whereas architects, to me, seem to be willing to do anything as long as they get their 10%. I've been there already, so, yeah, of course I would. I would accept anything. Yeah, I think... it's a good question in terms of that when does one lose one's critical agenda? And normally, in most people's cases, it's when you start making lots of money. And to be quite honest, I'm not particularly interested in making lots of money, not because I don't think money is a nice thing to have, and lots of it, I'm sure, is better than having none of it. But at the end of the day, what makes me kind of wake up in the morning is to sort of think about how do I actually see myself within contemporary critical discourse, and to try and put into practice what I think, rather than just to sort of read a book about, a philosopher who might come from the Frankfurt School and think, that's interesting. At the end of the day, if what's interesting can actually promote what one produces, then that seems to me the only reason to be in a profession which is about visual practice, which becomes inhabited by culture. So hopefully I would never lose my critical agenda, and the only reason to keep it humorous is the fact that otherwise I'd die of sadness. You know, that architecture is so fucking depressing that it's hard enough sort of doing it, being happy, and doing it badly would just make it really not worth it. I mean, plumbing is even better than architecture because at least you can enjoy every day. You just have to do 5 tasks and you know they're finished and you'll get your pay. And that's I mean, I'm not dismissing it. I mean, it's a fantastic profession where you don't have to worry about critique. And if architect doesn't worry about critique, then is it like plumbing? And if it is like plumbing, then it's not well paid enough for me to want to do it that way. No one threw anything. Normally people throw things at me. I mean, I don't think they're sarcasm. You know, at the end of the day, if people think that they're sarcastic, they're actually not. I mean, what one is laughing at is one's own prejudices, if anything. And so, yeah. I think a lot of the kind of motivation behind the projects is to actually make not only the practitioners that are included in the actual projects aware of what their significance might be, but also how the spectator might, in a way, visit that particular condition. So the projects are always about trying to make visible what normally is concealed. So like in architecture, the rhetoric of the drawing, why do architects draw in a way that only architects can understand or speak in a way that only architecture can include? So it's trying to sort of dismantle all the structures, not for the sake of leaving them dismantled, but more to sort of understand that if people can understand the elemental condition, then when it's reconstituted, they'll be able to somehow participate. So it's about participation, I suppose. Shall I see who can whittle who down first? I'm winning, I think.
It doesn't matter what one's politics are at the end, so long as voices can be heard. You might be able to clear out the voice of the person who wants to build a high-rise in a place where one can, despite the fact that maybe incredibly damaging politics behind it, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the issue about that it's not possible for us at times to actually buy the project as criticism as opposed to a kind of relentless advocacy for freedom, which in the end doesn't solve things. An argument it uses everything else that's kind of pathetic to operate on. But in a funny way, and in the most generous kind of way, it simply opens up the door literally for everyone else to kind of think about that. I think that's the most brilliant aspect of it, and conceptually is that there's no reason to have an argument with you because it's not you and your politics with which we would take issue. That's the way I kind of read the project. Would you say that
yeah.
Really is part of the...
I think what you're saying is probably the most generous thing one could say about the work. That what this is say precedes the work, as you say, is the actual strategy that one employs in order to invest or investigate that particular condition. So, if let's say you were going to build a tall building, how would one, as a kind of consultant, which if that's the right term, would one go about sort of inquiring critically whether that would be the most pertinent or the most ridiculous thing to do? I mean, that would interest me in the sense that I wouldn't suggest that the answer would be that I would always somehow, like a magician, pull out the rabbit from the hat and make it smile. It might be a dead rabbit. So at the end of the day, it's to say that that often these projects start off asking a question, but the kind of answer is the wrong answer. And somehow, when you do it again, you have to work out how does one modify the question in order to get the answer that might be more relevant to the kind of discourse you're trying to set up. But in terms of, let's just say, where it ends and where it stops, I mean, the intention behind these projects is that these particular different, events somehow always will inform one's practice, so that from those investigations you can actually sort of understand that, like, let's say the advertising agency in Amsterdam, that before having done all these other art projects, one would never have thought about the fact that if you're just going to be able to fax it and you're going to give someone a menu to choose from, how does one construct this menu? What constitutes desire or aspiration? So they all, as I say, inform the one's practice. The theory does bleed into the practice in a way that, hopefully is something that educates myself, rather than just that person who it's aimed at. I don't know if that was actually the answer to your question. Not really. It wasn't a question, I suppose. I mean, as I say, this is just one position amongst many others. I mean, Will Alsop, who's going to come speak here, doesn't have a problem at all. I mean, he builds fantastic buildings and is able to be commissioned continuously to build new build. But I suppose it's where you want to position yourself that interests me. That at the end of the day, when you teach students, what's quite interesting is that that it's very difficult to make clear to them that they can either become a keyboard monkey, working for Rogers or Foster's, never having any say in what things look like, or they can try and actually maybe sort of promote a practice or become part of a practice that would in many ways be more comfortable for them. And I mean comfortable in terms of a critical comfort rather than a kind of economic comfort. And I suppose that's maybe what fascinates me, is that trying to sort of become comfortable with oneself before you can actually sort of export any external condition. As far as I understand, we're leaving. No, that's what I've been told by my master. Why is that?
I have a seminar finishing here on the
right.
figurine competition.
Oh, right. Well, that's a